celebrated, you were supposed to take those in the same way, because it really didn't matter. It all was determined beforehand. The only thing you had control over was whether you could do virtuous good things. Well, I mean, what does that sound like? That's very much an idea we have in our culture now, that I can't control the world around me, I don't really know about this whole afterlife thing, I don't know about this whole God thing, whatever, but I know I can do good deeds, and I'll do good deeds, and that is how I will be good, right? So what's interesting is what we find is that so much of what we think as being sort of cutting-edge, progressive thought in America is really just these old, dead Greek guys telling us all how to live. It's kind of amazing. It's one of those fascinating things that most of us, all of us, are beholden in some way to someone. None of us have just come up with the newest, coolest way to live. It's a fascinating world. And the more we know about the ancient world, the more we just sort of see the arguments of people around us just sort of coming back again. I just thought of this new great way to live. So, with that in mind, let's talk about doubts. Let's talk about a couple of people's doubt in this world. One of the main ways that people will talk about why they don't believe in God, and why we're talking about this evening, is this problem of evil. I mean, it's Epicurus' problem, it's a lot of people's problem about God. And it's a reasonable thing. I mean, one of the things that we do not want to ever discount when we talk about evil or pain is that they are terrible things, right? I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, when I hear Christians talk about, or any faith group, talk about evil, they sort of discount it and say, don't worry about it. And that can kind of get some play in America, where we aren't necessarily just right up in front of real persecuting evil every single day, right? I mean, I think back to my stories my grandmother used to tell me of how they used to bury a classmate a year from polio. And that's not something we just generally feel. I mean, I had a classmate die in a car accident when I was in high school, and it destroyed the school. Like, nobody could, it just, ended everybody. Like, people were crying in the hallways. Like, can you imagine just how used to death you had to be able to be not that long ago? Like, my grandmother was 80 years old. It's not that long ago, right? We live in a very different world, and so you can kind of get away with, from the pulpit or within Christian communities or within any kind of faith community, kind of saying, don't worry about evil, you're not going to get that much exposure to it. But unfortunately, that's a really crummy way to talk about this. You really are going to get exposed to evil. You're going to get exposed to death. You're going to get exposed to pain. And if you pick up a paper or you look, what am I, 80? If you look online, if you read the newspaper online, if you look on news sources, you're going to see evil all the time. Matter of fact, now we kind of live in an interesting world where we sort of nationalize news. So if someone does something terrible 10 states away, we know about it instantly. That's actually a really new thing. People didn't used to have that access to all that. So it can kind of seem like the whole world is ending all around us all the time. I mean, people are always doing bad things, but it's something to keep in mind. But, so, first off, how many people have ever heard of, no one knew Epicurus, that's okay. But how many people have heard of Charles Darwin? Darwin, good indeed. All right, so Charles Darwin, of course, is the famous 19th century biologist who sort of, his book, The Origin of Species, sets the foundation for evolutionary thought, right? I mean, no one right now is a pure Darwinian, but the neo-Darwinian synthesis is very much the way in which we think of the world growing. So with that in mind, for a prize, does anyone know what the name of the ship he took to the Galapagos was? Ooh, Angela. Wow, I didn't think I was going to get that. Congratulations, you get a pencil from the wonderful people at Jot. I did not get this at the dollar store. But from the wonderful people at Jot, the pencil. Feel free to use that however you want. Matter of fact, Apple just came up with the iPencil. Everyone hear about this? The iPencil. And I have to say, I don't know that it's that much better than the regular pencil. I gotta be honest with you. I really did want to buy into this, right? Like this, oh man, this is revolutionize writing. And it strikes me I can do most everything it does with like a piece of paper. Like I can't draw very well, as you'll probably see tonight. But I don't know. I don't know if it's useful to me. Anyway, HMS Beagle, very good. That was the ship he took. But Darwin, if believe it or not, was a believing Christian until late in his life. Of a type. Matter of fact, he actually wanted to be a clergyman before he became a biologist. It's kind of a fascinating thing about Darwin. His biography is really something. But there were two things that really shook his faith. The first thing was a wasp. A wasp. So there's this parasitical wasp, right? This isn't a wasp. This is a caterpillar, right? So there's a parasitical wasp. The Latin name, I want to get this right, is Ichneumonidae. Ichneumonidae, sorry. And it's a parasitical wasp that lays eggs inside of the caterpillar. And then the eggs hatch and they eat the caterpillar alive. And the wasp keeps the caterpillar alive because it needs the caterpillar to be alive, because if it dies, then it can't be food for its larvae, right? Darwin looked at this and said, a good God would never make this. This is horrifying, right? This caterpillar being eaten to death by a wasp is too horrible. No good God would make that. So that was datum one, right? Can't be a God if there's this thing, right? Two, his daughter died, right? His daughter Annie, his beloved first daughter, died. And that pain, that evil he experienced, led him to say, no good God would allow my daughter to die. She didn't harm anyone. Why would he allow this? And so these two things in his journals, which we now have, this is a bad thing about dying, is we can read all your journals. So if you keep a journal, just be advised someone's going to read it, or, nowadays we share everything, but like his private journals we can all read now, but anyway. So in his private journals, these are the things that he says are what shook his faith and drove him away from God. And those sound like a pretty powerful piece of evidence, right? Anyone who's lost someone close to them knows how much that hurts. I don't know if anyone, even if it, oftentimes we find that it's, I find with most young people that it's pets or things like that. But anyone who's lost like a family member really knows what that hurt feels like. And it's, in some ways, that pain can become more real than anything else in your life. Right? That can be very much a thing, particularly as it's happening to you. I mentioned that I have a daughter and a son on the way, but when I was younger, my wife and I, as a matter of fact, this is 2010, we had a son who died. I don't talk about it very often, but actually I probably should talk about it more. And I can tell you that in those days that followed, those days and weeks that followed, it was a kind of pain I wouldn't want to wish on my worst enemy. It's still something that is in some ways raw. So I can understand to a certain extent that this would be an outlet of anger, right? The pain turns into anger, and anger turns in against God. But is this a rational argument against God? Is this a reasonable argument against God? When Darwin believed in God, so much so that he was considering becoming a minister, did the wasp exist? Yeah, it did. Did people die, like, all around him? Yeah. So what changed? Did those things become real, substantiated? What made those things change? What made them change is they began to affect him, right? He now knew about this wasp. He knew the pain of losing a daughter. And so it was that pain which caused him to turn from God. Is that a reasonable, rational argument for whether or not God exists? Well, no, it's not. It's an emotional argument about whether or not God exists. And that can feel very real to us, but that's not the same as proving anything. We wouldn't want someone, for instance, to build a bridge based on their emotion, right? We would want them to build a bridge based on their knowledge of mathematics and architecture, right? Hopefully, when we're talking about whether or not God exists, we're using logic or reason. Hopefully, we're using the science of God, and specifically theology, to better understand Him, not just whether or not we hurt. So that's very interesting, where someone who's such a logical, fascinating, brilliant thinker, such as Charles Darwin, could have this really really sloppy thinking for the reasons why he doesn't believe in God. And this is something you'll see all the time in terms of arguments from people who don't believe in God. That there's no logic or reason in that whatsoever. All there is, though, is that real pain. But I think Darwin is half right. I mean, he really is. He's right in that the thing that was kind of floating around the world at the time was this idea that God was a watchmaker. Have you ever heard this theory before? The watchmaker theory of the natural world? Well, the idea was it was floated by a naturalist named William Paley. And it really got abused more than it was really helpful. But Paley said that God sort of creates, one of the ways you know there's a God is you can look out at the grand universe, even, this is Earth, or an egg, whatever. But the space around the universe, you could look at that and see an order to it that pointed toward God. What's interesting is, if one is familiar with a lot of the debates within modern physics, oftentimes people will talk about that the cosmology of the universe appears as if it's been monkeyed with. It doesn't appear as if it's following any pattern that would allow for life to be created. It just seems to be perfect for that to happen, which is odd. So that's why you get ideas of things like the multiverse or string theory, or kind of ideas you hear now. That's a different discussion. My only thing about multiverses is it takes an awful lot of blind faith in that theory to believe in multiverses. It takes an awful lot of blind faith to think that there are multiple universes I can't see, and that's why we exist. That's hard. That's hard for me to buy. I would never ask someone in here to buy something with that little evidence to it, right? But it's fascinating that people think that's a really, really good answer, and it's really, really not. It's very, very theoretical. But anyway, so Paley says, okay, now what ends up happening, though, is people then say, well, okay, we can look at the world then, like it's a watch, right? And God sort of sets it and then walks away, and it's this perfect watch working. One of the things he talked about was the eye, right? He said, like, the eye is this intricate thing, and it points towards God, right? But the really good question then becomes, well, what about blind people, right? What about all the horrible things in the world where, we have all sorts of deformities? What about, and then you kind of go wide with it, what about all the problems that are in the world? And so Darwin, if his intellectual enemy, they actually went to the same college, which is kind of funny, Paley and Darwin. Matter of fact, their portraits at the university, it escapes me at the moment, face each other. They're both looking at each other for, I guess, all of history now. They're both staring at each other. But if that's who you're arguing against, then I think that's a knockdown. You've KO'd that argument. The Earth is not a perfect watch that's running perfectly, which then you can look at and go and say, oh yeah, that's definitely God, right? I think that's an obvious thing. But is that actually the God that anybody who knows what they're talking about is arguing for? Is that the God that's actually revealed in the Bible, for instance? Like this God who sort of sets a watch and then rolls out and then it all works perfectly. And then you know that you find this watch. I mean, literally I just sort of find this watch on the beach and you go, oh, someone must have made this watch, right? Richard Dawkins, who of course is an evolutionary biologist and amateur philosopher, who wrote a book that was big. Maybe this is still a big book, I don't know. It was big when I was younger. It's called The God Delusion. Have you still read this? Is it a thing? It's got like a silver cover on it. Anyway, The God Delusion. He's a very famous evolutionary biologist and atheist. But his whole idea is that God, if he is a watchmaker, he's a blind watchmaker. Like he's just bad at it. So if he's a blind watchmaker, then you don't need them. Then maybe he doesn't exist. There's no watchmaker, right? And yeah, again, boom, you're just beating Paley up. I mean, he's dead, so he can't really fight back. But he's been dead a long time. But yeah, just sort of kicking his corpse, I guess. But again, I don't think Paley was ever really trying to say that. I think his argument was really kind of about a bigger sort of cosmological outside universe argument, not really hey, some people can see 2020, so there must be a God. That's really not it is. But that's oftentimes, when we try to argue with people, the temptation is always for us to take take the worst part of their argument and beat it up. It's oftentimes called a straw man. Right? Anybody can beat up a straw man. So if I take someone's argument and just make it completely weak and useless and then beat it up, I look like I really know what I'm talking about. But I haven't really answered any of the questions that are really there, right? This is a temptation. It's a temptation in all of us. I'm tempted to do that as well. But feel free, by the way, in any of this, to call me out and say that doesn't make sense, or you're wrong, or I don't like you, or your face is dumb. That's perfectly fine to say. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I talk to angry people all the time, and it's fine. Matter of fact, I like it when people get angry because it means that they actually are listening and feeling something, which is fine. It's bad when people don't get angry, I think. Because the things we're going to talk about, the things I say in this room are things that should sort of rock our world and scare us to a certain extent. But anyway, so that's Darwin, and I really do think that it's sort of a tragedy. There are various rumors about where Darwin came down and all this. His wife was a believer, which was always a fascinating thing. She was a very, very devout Christian, so that dynamic at home was very interesting. But it's interesting to think of that doubt he had came from those two events, and it's not a rational doubt. But let's look at someone else's doubt. So we talked about Darwin. Great beard, Darwin. Have you seen Darwin's beard? It's just killer beard. And the beards are back in a big way, and my wife is telling me I can never, ever have a beard, which is fine. I one time when I was a sailor, we used to do these silly things. You'd cut all your hair off and then try to grow a mustache. And I can grow a mustache. What's that? Is that a question? This is a real thing. There are pictures. It's horrifying. And I can grow a mustache. Unfortunately, it comes in very Hitler-esque at first, and then sort of grows out. This is not a good look. It's really, really hard to pull off the Hitler. You really can't. At best, you're Charlie Chaplin, but you have to wear a hat. The second you take a hat off, you get it's bad. Anyway, that's an awful thing. Anyway, all right. So Darwin, and then let's talk about C.S. Lewis. And so, interestingly, Lewis and Darwin have very different trajectories. C.S. Lewis, you may know him from the Chronicles of Narnia. He wrote that. He also wrote a science fiction series on a dare with J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit. And so they had a dare that they would both write science fiction books, and Tolkien reneged, and he never did, and Lewis wrote 3. They're not Lewis's best books, but they're pretty great. The best one is the second one, Paralandria, where he imagines a world in which that's never fallen. And this human being is dropped in this world, and he has to try to prevent the fall of this world. So he's basically trying to out-argue the devil, who's trying to convince these people to sin and follow him. It's a fascinating book, actually. But anyway, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis has a completely opposite trajectory of Darwin in that Lewis spent the vast majority of his life as an atheist. And one of the big reasons he was an atheist is because of the problem of evil. Some of the people who've studied him is Dr. Art Lindsay is a good one on this. When Lewis met Christians, he would pose the problem of evil to them, and he always felt like they were just trying to dodge it, which is something that you'll get all the time. However, it gradually dawned on him that his argument depended on the idea that there was, in fact, real evil in the world. Evil was not an illusion, or just a feeling or emotive response to an unpleasing event. But where had he gotten this idea of evil? He realized that his atheism proved no basis for it. So that's the question that Lewis would ask of Darwin. It's the question he would ask of all of us, really. If we do think that, for instance, the loss of my son or any of the evil you will face in your life, if we do think that that's evil, why do we think it's evil? It's not a very good answer to say because it hurts me. Right? Does that mean that everything that hurts you is evil? What if you were having cancer surgery? That's going to hurt an awful lot. Is that evil? Well, no, that's not evil because it's curing. Well, then everything that hurts you isn't evil. That's not a very good argument for that thing being evil. Right? So here's what Lewis says about this specifically. This is his own words. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So this is a little bit of sort of mental judo going on, right? But the problem we have here is that if I call the world unjust and evil, which it definitely is, by the way, right? The world is very unjust, it's very evil, it's very corrupt. It's all those things. You're never going to get an argument from me that that's not true. Matter of fact, it's fascinating. I have to try to convince people sometimes that the world is unjust and cruel and terrible. It is, 100%. I mean, we live in this bubble, right, of sort of Western civilization. We live kind of in a nerf world right now. But I can tell you that is not I can tell you that is not the story of humanity, right? Even in most of the world now. Like, I was reading a story the other day, there are 40 million people in China right now who live in caves. Could you live in a cave? How long would you last in a cave? Like, real talk. Like a long time? Not very long. Right? I wouldn't last very long, right? So, I mean, so there's a certain sense in which when I talk about the world being unjust and cruel and terrible, you kind of have to look outside of yourself. But, I mean, there's a broader critique we can make of ourselves and sort of everything around us and what we accept as being good, what we accept as being bad. How did we come up with those definitions? The answer, when we really probe ourselves, may not be very deep. It may just have been something somebody told us. Then we want to know who told us this, right? But that's Lewis's point. Here it is, his conversion. He was actually converted by J.R.R. Tolkien, the writer of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. They were having a walk one night, and he'd been working on it for a while, and this problem came up, and they talked it through. And that was the thing that was blocking Lewis. And of course, C.S. Lewis would become, as I write in this paper, probably the most famous Christian apologist of the 20th century, in the 20 years after he was converted, before he died in 1963. His most famous talks, of course, were during the Nazi bombings of England. Every night he would come to the radio and he would give a talk about Christianity, actually. These lectures would eventually become his very famous book, Mere Christianity. But he would continue lecturing. I mean, his books are fascinating in themselves, and his fiction is quite good as well. But it really is a great question. What allows us to talk about injustice? What allows us to talk about evil? How do we come up with those terms? If they're not grounded in anything, if they're not grounded specifically in God. So, let's talk a little bit more. The next part is, what is good? So an argument theists will hear, and by the way, theist is someone who believes there's a God. Now, a person who doesn't believe there's a God might be a Christian, right? Right? We're all 100%. You could be a theist and believe that God is the sun, for instance, right? A theist is just anyone who believes there's a God. It's the opposite of an atheist, right? An atheist believes that the part there neutralizes the theist part, so there's no God. But a theist argument, something you'll hear from atheists, is that, you go on the internet for 10 seconds and you'll find this. You theists deny that atheists can be good, but we prove our moral superiority because we can be good without your silly sky fairy. right? I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say this, or you're a flying spaghetti monster, or those kinds of things. So the idea here is that the person who doesn't have God is morally superior to someone who believes in God because they don't have something forcing them to be good, right? Well, boy, that sounds pretty reasonable. Or, and there's a sense here in which a person can say, I'm braver than you because I try to be good even though there's not God. The problem is, this is a straw man argument. This is not the argument, the best argument that Christians have made about why we need a God in order to have morality. The better argument is the actual position one finds in the Bible and in Christian moral thought is that without God, there's nothing to ground a belief in objective morality. And without objective morality, nothing can be called evil or good or bad because it all becomes a matter of opinion. What do I mean by that? All right. So say, for instance, Sydney thinks nobody should eat chocolate because chocolate is evil. And Sydney has worked it out that everybody who eats chocolate is actually becoming evil too. And so Marian, though, says that that's preposterous. I love chocolate. I have no reason to stop eating chocolate, and I refuse. So, if Sydney has just created this, let's call it a law, we'll call it a rule, how can she force Marian to follow it? Well, in a theistic system, in a system where there's a God, right, she could appeal to Marian and say, Marian, we both worship the same God, right? That God has created the universe in a specific way, and chocolate is, we'll see use chocolate, we'll continue to use chocolate, and chocolate is an evil that he's abolished. If we both believe in this, how could we not agree? And Marian goes, oh, that's really interesting. It's obviously here that this is something that is wrong and evil. I agree with you, and now we're there. The problem is that if we just say that there is no God, if there's no supernatural intelligence who's created the world and established it in a certain way, now it becomes your idea that chocolate is bad is simply a matter of your opinion. And the only way you can convince Marian that she shouldn't eat chocolate is through force, right? You have to force her to believe the way you want her to believe. Because it really is just a matter of your opinion. And then all of her beliefs are really just opinions too, right? So there's no transcendence, there's no idea that we are any way bigger than ourselves. All morality simply becomes basically a figment of our imagination. So it can get pretty wild. So for instance, Ella says that the Constitution is how we'll determine all this, right? It's written down, it's got the laws, boom, we've got this. Constitution is what will decide what's right and wrong. Well, I mean, the Constitution based itself on natural laws, which of course base themselves on there being a natural law giver, right? And if that natural law giver doesn't actually exist, then you might as well base your civic code on the Twilight series of books, or Game of Thrones. I mean, whether it's just what is one of the most watched shows in the world? I read the first book years ago because I had to for a class. But one of the things that show is sort of all about, and I don't recommend the show at all, but anyway, it's the idea that the author is working with is it's a world without any God. And so how you gain power, you just have to destroy everyone until you're on top. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that there haven't been people who have claimed a God and have then just tried to destroy the people to make them believe the same thing. But the argument we would have to make is that any evidence we find of what that God actually says about himself makes that position erroneous. What do you think?
What about the idea that, if there were a God, then of course it would be wrong because he says it is wrong, but
But the problem is, you absolutely have to force people to believe that. I mean, that's what's happening right now. I mean, there are 3 countries in the world that believe that you can abort children all the way till basically they're about to pop out. It's us, China, and North Korea, right? And how did that happen? Right? In Nuremberg in 45, when we were trying Nazi war criminals, one of the things we were trying them for was abortion. It took less than a generation for 5 people to decide that abortion was cool. And not only cool, but a constitutional right. If you'd asked anyone who'd been in the Constitutional Convention if they thought abortion was a constitutional right, they would have said, you're out of your mind. But 5 people decided that it was an inherent right in the document. And then how do you enforce that? By force, right? If laws are always enforced by, at the end of the day, guns and jail, right? That's how they work. That's the authority of them, right? I mean, why do your parents pay taxes? Would they rather not, right? Why do they do that? So they don't go to jail. So some guy with a gun doesn't come by and take them to jail. So why do we allow, why do people who think abortion is murder allowed in this country? Well, it's because if they try to stop it, they will be shot or go to jail, right? So of course there's force involved to make people do what you want. It's always force. What do you think? Thoughts? Thoughts? You have a question, please?
I have a question.
Absolutely.
You were talking about how, like your example, you read Marianne Sydney?
Sydney, very good.
Yeah,
You almost got a pencil for that, but we don't want to lower the
so,
stereotypes.
you were saying that their faith allowed them to reach, the same conclusion, but there are a lot of people under faith who can have, different beliefs under that faith. Like, not every Christian believes the same thing in the same way, so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you absolutely can have conflict within religions. You can have conflict within religions that disagree with one another, right? So if our goal is to eliminate conflict, you basically come from this in the way people thought about it in the Enlightenment period, right? So we can live in a pluralistic society. We'll get rid of religious conflict. And then we'll all just sort of have religion as kind of the thing we keep close to our chest, and we all kind of live our lives and try to have the most happiness as we can. The problem is you end up not just getting rid of religion in this situation, you have to get rid of everybody's thoughts and make them into sort of a monolithic thought. And to the victor, the spoils are given. I mean, it is constantly a struggle within our country, but within all the countries in the world, to gain power and make other people believe the way you want them to believe. Now, the argument we would make about the theistic approach to this is that there actually is a space in which we can learn and become real moral actors. I was going to talk about this a little bit later. But within this space, we can actually talk about this God and the world He's created and find common ground in that space. But if all morality is simply something that I've come up with, it's just off the top of my head, or if all morality, all ethics are simply what I wish the world was like, right? Then my morality, my ethics are no better than yours, that you could come up with in your room tonight, right? And so then how do we determine who's right? Well, there's a couple of ways. One is force, power, whoever's in power is the one who's right. How many people can I get to agree with me, right? Like, can I get 51% of the people to agree with me, and then we'll crush the 49% who disagree? And this becomes the metric by which agreement comes, rather than there being natural, immutable laws that whether or not people agree with them or not, we're still going to continue to stand by them. Now, what's bigger than that, of course, is the broad claim of this is that, at the end of the day, as a Christian moral thinker, my goal is not to end conflict in the world, because I know that's impossible. The problem is that for a person who's working off the idea that there is no God, that there is no world after this, that there is no judgment, that there is no value in us living a certain way and being moral people, then I have to create heaven here now. And the way I have to do that is if any person opposes me, I have to destroy them, because now that person is trying to prevent heaven from happening here right now. So this is why people freak out, for instance, right now these days in the realm of politics. And people who call themselves Christians do this too, because they see any kind of political setback as being someone preventing heaven on earth from happening. So they freak out. You can't let that person have a different opinion. Whereas, as a theist, as someone who believes in God, I am perfectly willing to have someone have a different opinion than me. It's not my job even to convince them otherwise. My job is simply to tell them the truth and pray that they change their heart. I don't have to destroy them or kill them in order to make heaven on earth, because it's not my job. God is the one who makes heaven. And I definitely believe that the world is on a course towards that when Christ returns, that we will have a world without corruption, without injustice. And I believe it's my job to do my best to live as if that world is happening right now. So I have to be very active in that, right? This doesn't let me off the hook at all. But what it does do is it prevents me from thinking I need to crush other people who believe differently than me. And that's something you're going to run into in college, and you're going to like, why are people freaking out about everything? Why are they shouting down speakers? Why are they burning things? Why are they just insane about everything? And the reason is because they think they've got to make heaven happen themselves. Whether we call it utopia, whether we call it a better world, whatever people call it, I got to make it happen. And the person who believes different than me is in the way. So they can't have that idea. They can't have that opinion, because I've got to stop them. That is the problem that we have here in a world without God. And there is no really super good answer for that. Now, I hope that answers some of that. That's a bigger discussion we can have. I don't want to shortchange you on that, because that's a very, very good point. The argument against people who use religion in order to hurt other people are that they're doing it wrong, right? Which can be totally true. You can be very, very religious and be terrible, right? Religion, I mean, as I say, I would very much argue that all people have a religion. We talked about this in our first class, but all people have a religion. Religion is just means the rule of life, how you live your life. Whatever the thing you spend time with, whatever the thing you work for, whatever you daydream about is kind of the thing that you're actually living for. Whatever you serve is what you love, and whatever you love is what you worship. So everyone has a religion in some way. It's maybe silly. It may be NASCAR or something. If that's your religion, God bless you. I don't think that's going to work out super well. You can enjoy NASCAR, but if you think that that's how you're going to save the world, I don't think it's going to happen. But anyway, and that's true of any kind of sports. It's true of any kind of distraction that we have. But I want to say in this sort of vacuum of objectivity, when it's all subjective, and I'm the one who has to try to make the world a better place through my power and through my imagination, it's a pretty terrible world. We're never going to come out of that into a world of peace and prosperity, because there's always going to be someone to be crushed. Always someone we're going to have to get rid of in order to get us closer to paradise. Right? This is a lesson we learned in the 20th century, but we're kind of forgetting. Like every sort of great movement, whether it was fascism, whether it was socialism and communism, they were tried in various countries. Well, you kind of had to get rid of all the bad people, and then you would have the great world after it. You got to break some eggs to make an omelet. So you got to end up having to kill a lot of people. I don't think that's the right way. I really don't. So what does this mean? If we really have to have an objective standard, or we're literally going to kill each other, what does this mean? It means that the presence of evil in our universe does not disprove God. It means that the presence of evil in our universe does not disprove God, but rather it serves as a piece of evidence for God by demonstrating his existence and involvement. Because without a standard for moral perfection, we can't say the word evil. If there's no such thing as perfect good, then what are we talking about when we say evil? Purely something in our imagination. You might as well talk about your favorite show than talk about some action as being evil. Because what are you comparing it to? Someone else's imagination, your imagination? It's nothing. And so at the end of the day, evil, in a very fascinating sense, rather than disproving God, actually points towards his actual existence. The famous Christian theologian who also was an atheist, and well, he was a lot of things. St. Augustine of Hippo, who wrote a great book called The Confessions, all about how he was a terrible person. A lot of people think it's kind of the first autobiography ever written. He was a bishop at the time, and people said, you used to be terrible. He said, yeah, I was. And then he wrote a whole book about it to show how terrible he was. And it is something. Like, we're talking like he had, bastard children, like a wife he left, all sorts of just rough stuff. I mean, the Roman Empire in this period of time was pretty wild. You could do a lot of sin at this time. But this book, but Augustine said that, evil is necessary for us to see good. Can we imagine a whole universe in which there wasn't evil? Well, there was no evil. Well, how would we even know what good was? We would have nothing to compare it to at all, right? It's a fascinating thing to think about. And as I say, it doesn't change the trajectory of our pain, but it does show that evil doesn't disprove God, which Epicurus was very, very sure about. But 1,000 years later, St. Augustine was just dunking on him all over the place, which is not good. I mean, if they'd had Twitter in the 4th century, it would have been pretty funny. But anyway. Okay, but what it also means is that any theory we have about morality, if it isn't objectively grounded with God, that it is just a pleasant thing we hope happens. And the only way you can keep people in line is through power, it's through force, or it's through other stuff like numbing agents, like entertainment, entertainment's a great example of this. I mean, you ever thought about the fact that entertainment is meant to keep you docile and like unquestioning and not thinking about stuff too hard? You ever thought about that? Like, it's a fascinating thing. There's a big part of it. Or like, diet, like the food you're told you need to buy and eat. Does that change the way you live? But entertainment's a great example of it. I mean, there's so much of entertainment is just mindless nonsense. That is literally changing the way you think about the world and forming you and making you think in different ways. And ultimately, it's keeping you in line. It's really something. So you don't necessarily need to have, like, we don't live in a country where we have people marching. We have a lot of police in our country, but we don't have we don't live in a police state, right? We have the freedom of assembly. We have a lot of freedoms. But there are a lot of forces making you think of particular ways. This is something that always blows my mind when people it's one of those funny things where this is a big thing on social media, right? Where there'll be like some political belief that a corporation will then like put out like a big advertisement saying, we're on the side of this group of people, right? Like, we're with you. Like, why are they doing that? Because they want your money. Like, it isn't like anyone's sitting around like, boy, we really love these people who we're saying we support. No, they want your money. That's the purpose of it. And people are like, oh man, look at this. They're with me. They're not really with you. That's not. They don't really care about that stuff. I mean, if they thought they could make more money than going the other way, they would. But as I say, we're funny about that. These people do not have your back. Nobody really in that space has your back. Anybody who needs you not to put up a fight doesn't have your back, whether they're politicians or running these massive companies. That's something we should know better. And that's the shame, right? If we think politics is the way we're going to change the world, then we gotta trust those people, and they're just going to let you down every single time, always, unfortunately, because they're human beings too. You can't solve the problem of evil that we find in this way. So let's talk about some more. Last thing, and then we'll roll out here with some questions, and you can call me stupid, whatever. So I have to end on point 6 that that in Christianity we would argue that specifically, the argument that's never really brought up is how Jesus Christ is an answer to the problem of evil. And we think this is very, very important datum in understanding the world we live in. So I have a long quote here from the great theologian N.T. Wright. Because I could say all those things about the moral universe and how you gotta have an objective standard, you gotta have God in order to have morality, but can't you still be mad at God, right? Can't I still judge God? Can I be mad at him for creating this world where there has to be evil, right? Why can't I? Well, let's talk about why that's not a great position. So there's a long quote here, but I'll read it out because I really do think it is a good space to start in. The sort of creatures we are never going to be in a position to set a moral bar and insist that God, if there is a creator God, jump over it. It is like recognizing that the telescope I have, while very good at enabling me to see the moon, Jupiter, Saturn, and other glories, won't ever let me see a black hole, or several other things that the high-energy physicists and astronomers tell me are there. The instrument in question, my creaturely and innately rebellious humanity, can't pick up the full mysteries of God in the world. Of course, there is continuity between God's view of good and evil and ours, or it would be chaos come again. But we are never in a position to judge God, if God there be. That's not a pious platitude, but a rather obvious ontological reality. So the problem is that my finite brain, and I try pretty hard to fill it with good things, but I also fill it with a lot of garbage too, because I'm alive now, right? But I try to fill it with good things, but the idea that I could somehow comprehend, if we establish that there is a God, and super intelligence created the universe, that I could somehow just sort of figure him out by like reading blog posts online, is preposterous. Like that's never ever going to happen. I'm never going to totally figure him out. This is generally called in theology the incomprehensibility of God. Like I'm never just going to sort of just have him, put him in a box and understand him completely, right? Because I just don't have the equipment for it. I mean, think of all the things in your life that you don't understand, but just totally trust. Like your car. Could anybody here make a car? Like if you had to, go to the junkyard and just get to work, right? But you bet your life that car is going to get you from point A to point B. Like more people die in car wrecks than, basically it's the most dangerous thing you do every day, but you just trust that this thing you don't really understand is going to get you from A to B and everything's going to be okay, right? 100%. I gotta go, so I don't care. I'm in it, right? I mean, you hear about these. You ever read these terrifying recalls of these cars, where like there are like all these huge problems, and like the one where like the steering wheel stopped working, just to just careen off a cliff and stuff like that, right? But still, nope. I'm getting in my car. I'm going. I don't care, right? That's a fascinating bit of faith we have about stuff like that, right? Or cell phones. Nobody here could build a cell phone, but you sort of bet your life that if you're in an emergency, you can use it and it'll save you, right? There's all sorts of things like that in our life. We just accept on faith that that's a thing that's real, that's a thing that we trust. So if you don't understand those things, but you're perfectly willing to put your whole life right on that, it should strike you that it's not a crazy thing that if you don't totally understand God, that you would still be able to trust him in the work he does. Ultimately, if we get angry at God, any God that's big enough that we could actually get angry at him is a God who's so big that he would be doing things we wouldn't understand anyway, right? Any God who actually can control the universe obviously is a God so big that we couldn't possibly understand everything he's doing, right? I mean, it's sort of the difference between being in a parade as it's going down the street and being 30,000 feet up looking down at the parade. You see the end, you see all the people, you know everything that's happening if you're above it. But when you're in it, it just looks like a bunch of people with weird uniforms on and marching bands and glitter and all sorts of other things. I don't know what parade I'm in right now, but anyway. So yeah, that's a very different position to be in. And just to say that, well, this is the only perspective with which I have, so this must be everything, would be pretty silly. Like there's a front of the parade, there's a back of the parade, there's all sorts of people you've never met before, there's all sorts of stories you've never heard before, right? Just to sort of say that the few stories I have, the few little bits of information I've been able to grab, the people who agree with me, who I listen to, that's everything, and so I know everything, and so I can make this determination, of course there's no God. It's a fascinating position to be in. I just don't know how a person can get there. ultimately. I think it takes an awful lot of faith. But what is the Bible then? And he says in 2 minutes, no problem, easy day. So I have here a paragraph on this. The Bible is the story of how God, it's a lot of things, but it's the story of how God is dealing with the problem of evil by involving people who are evil in themselves. So if you've ever read the Old Testament and gone, holy smokes, what's going on here? This is horrifying. It is, because God is using evil people to solve the problem of evil. And they're going to do lots of evil, terrible things, right? I mean, look at King David, right? You know, he kills his best friend so he can sleep with his wife and impregnate her. Killer. Good job, friend. Way to solve the problem of evil, right? Nailing it. No, not nailing it, right? That's not good. So if anybody ever reads the Old Testament and go, I can't believe in a God who would act like this. Well, I mean, look at all the people involved. That's how we actually are. When we're freaked out by that, we're really just kind of freaked out by ourselves. But ultimately, this campaign against evil comes to its climax in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. How that happens is God the Son enters the human condition and reveals that the greatest weapon of evil, death, has been defeated by the good incarnate. That objective good standard, that thing that has to exist for there to be evil, he comes into human reality and suffers with us. And that's ultimately the thing that blows everybody's mind in 33 AD and creates this whole Christianity thing. It's what blows St. Paul's mind and forces him to convert and devote his life to spreading this gospel. And how does God solve the problem of evil? He does it through suffering, thus transforming suffering, the normal way we experience evil, into the means by which evil is defeated. It is not an accident that the front of this building has a first century torture device on the front of it, right? I mean, you might as well have a gas chamber or an electric chair or a lethal injection station up there, right? For most of human history, this was a way in which you horribly murdered people. Matter of fact, the Romans were good at it. You could keep a guy alive for weeks on a cross by giving him water and food, and eventually you would just suffocate. You drowned on land. That's how you died in crucifixion. You died of congestive heart failure. Horrifying. The Romans stole it from the Persians, but the Romans perfected it, which is what the Romans did. They were really good at taking stuff from people and just making it great. Crucifixion, they made it great. And so Jesus, that's one of the reasons if you ever read the gospel accounts, they're breaking the guy's legs, and so they can't push up anymore and they suffocate. Jesus died before them, that's why they just speared him, lucky him. But in any event, what Jesus is doing there, what God is doing there, is he's taking on the worst the world can offer. The greatest nation the world had ever seen, the Roman Empire, the greatest religion the world had ever seen. He takes that on and he bears it. And he reveals that suffering, what we think of as the worst evil, it can be defeated. The resurrection, we kind of get lost in the fact that like a guy came back from the dead. That's sort of the headline. Yeah, that's a big deal. Don't get me wrong. Guy coming back from the dead, big deal. But what's bigger about that is that it reveals that whatever evil is, whatever evil we have in our lives, whatever suffering we go through, that it isn't the end of the story. It never can be. And when I talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I'm asking you to believe in a historically verifiable resurrection of a person, a human being, right? And so I'm asking you to have trust in something that we have evidence for, and that evidence for that then changes your mind about the whole world. Now, people are obviously, because of what all that means for their lives, will dismiss that, certainly. But what I and the thousands of years of people who dress like me, who came before me, and have said the same thing to people, whether they killed them or not, is that having this God, having the suffering God, changes everything about who we are. It changes everything about how we experience suffering. And it makes evil something that is not only temporary, but evil's something that's already been defeated. So that's kind of what we do. All right, questions, thoughts? I'm scared, Coach. I hate you. This is stupid. What do you think? I don't want to say. Mari, what do you think?
Can I have just have a second to think through how I'm going to word this?
Okay, half a second.
Okay.
That was half a second, by the way.
So, you know how you said that when people disagree with someone who's trying to make heaven on earth with their standard, then they have to get rid of the other people who don't agree.
Or at least silence them as best as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
So, won't I'm not.
You're fine. Great. Call me out.
Won't God be like sending the people who remain in rebellion against Him into hell?
So, good question. And the answer is yes. But here's why that's not bad news. I guarantee that everybody in this room thinks there's someone who should go to hell. I mentioned the Holocaust earlier. Would everyone agree that Adolf Hitler should go to hell? 6 million burned alive people. We're there. We're pretty sure this is a bad guy. Right? We're there? Okay? All right. So if the problem is, though, once you've accepted that there's one person who you think should go to hell, who gets to make the call on like the cutoff line? Like, is there like who's the person who goes in and doesn't go in? Who makes that call? Because there's got to be some space in which there's like one guy who just squeaks past hell and one guy goes under. Like how does this work? Like he didn't tip his barista one week, so he's in, he's out. Like how does this work, right? Like there's got to be some space in which you make that call, right? Somebody's got to make that call, right? And I'll guarantee you, you want the person to make that call who is good incarnate, who is in and of himself the standard by which goodness and righteousness exist. Not me, for instance. I would not be good at this because there'd be a lot of people in there who would be getting it. There was a kid when I was in kindergarten who pulled my pants down the slide. You're going to hell, friend. I don't care if you're a neurosurgeon. I don't care if you're in Uganda right now saving lives. You're going to hell. See, that's why I shouldn't be in charge of this. And I'm not, thank God. Like, that's not my job to send people to hell or that's not my job. Thank God, right? But it's got to be somebody's. And it's God's, ultimately. But what's fascinating about that, of course, is that, Jesus comes to the world to draw people to him, to save them from that fate, right? And ultimately, humanity didn't do a great job because we kind of killed him. No big deal when he was trying to save us, right? That's not a great moment in human history, right? But it is an honest moment in human history. It's how we really are. And it proves that we really need something outside of ourselves to save us. That I'm not innately going to just figure out more like how to be a good person, and then that's going to solve all the world's problems. That's just never going to happen. It hasn't ever happened. So if someone tells you it is going to happen, they're telling you to believe it on complete blind faith. Right? Whereas that's not what I'm asking you to do at all. Blind faith is stupid. That's completely nuts. I'm asking you to believe in evidence. Logic, reason, those kind of things. But there are a lot of people who get that confused. Anyway. So does that help some? I mean, that's definitely going to happen. Absolutely. But once you've established that one person is going there, you've then established that there has to be a person who determines who else goes there. Right. What else do we think? Other questions? This is a good one. I love this stuff. I'll keep answering all day. What do you think?
There's a lot of different people of different religions and different people who don't believe in God.
Absolutely.
And they're still good people. But
I'm listening, please. I just want to make sure.
Right, make sure I got this.
You're fine. You're
But
fine.
this is another issue that some people
Yeah, I mean, you're going to hear Christians say a lot of stupid things. I'm going to tell you that right now. I hear Christians say stupid things all the time. Like, I just sometimes want to go, stop talking. Just stop talking, friend. You are a moron. All the time. So let's start there. There are a lot of stupid Christians, right? But that's 100% the case. But that's because, Christians, the Christian belief isn't that I'm a great person and that's why I'm going to heaven. Now, there are some Christians who think there's probably a lot of Christians who think that. But that's not true. That's not how any of this works, right? The truth is that person is good, and that's why I'm going to heaven. The truth in Christianity is that there's only ever been one good person in the history of the world, and that person volunteered to die for us. So when we talked about about good people, and I don't mean this in a mean way at all or a bad way, because we all do it. Once you've decided, you're saying there that there are lots of good people who aren't Christians. What has qualified you to say that those are good people? I mean, they pay their taxes, they walk their dogs, they open the door for old ladies. What's the thing that makes them good? And that's the problem, right? Now we're deciding who's good. Now we're saying we're God. We've lost the distinction between, am I the creator or am I the creature? If I'm the creature, I don't get to determine who's good or who's bad. And I'm a guy with a collar on. And people are like, man, those people are really judgmental, those priest guys, man. They're always like telling people who are good and bad. Yeah, I do not, I don't get to be the one who says who's a good and who's a bad person. Now, I can look at someone's life and say that they are sinning against God, right? But it's not an idea that I can be the one who defines goodness, right? But that's something we always want to do. This is at the heart of the Christian idea of our flawed anthropology, our flawedness as humans, is that we constantly want to usurp the power God has taken for himself and start just sort of doling it out. So when we start saying the word good people, that there are good people who aren't Christians, the argument is actually there aren't any good people in any of this. There's a good person who has given us his righteousness and is reforming us, purging us of evil if we are his. But this is a lifelong process that begins with us submitting ourselves to him and saying, I can't do this myself. I need you. Now that shouldn't be hard, because I do dumb stuff like leave my coffee cup in my car, right? And the notion that I can save myself from whatever fate I don't even totally understand in terms of the afterlife, or what comes after you die, is a wild idea. I stub my toe in the dark. I step on Legos. Like, why do I step on Legos? Right? Why do I do that? I obviously don't have this all figured out, right? But what I do know is that Jesus Christ, that God does have it figured out, and that I have the highest probability of knowing truth by believing him, right? And that's the thing. So as I say, when we start talking about do you have to be a religious person to be a good person, my argument would be that religious people aren't good people. God is, and then he is making us good over time, a long time. Some of us need a lot of time, right? I need a lot of time, right? But then it's in the world to come. It's in the new heaven, the new earth, in which we experience. That's what we're being. We're built for that. The longing we have to have this heaven on earth is a good thing, but we're just not going to make it by electing the right person or building the Starship Enterprise or whatever the heck we think we're going to do to make the world a perfect place. It ain't going to happen that way. But that longing is good. It's proof that we are moving towards something. My argument and the argument of Christianity is that the resurrection of Jesus Christ proves that we as human beings are built for a different kind of existence. An glorified existence, as we would call it, but an existence that's different than what we're experiencing right now. And again, I'm not telling you to believe this based on blind faith. I'm asking you to believe this based on this thing that happened, right? Which is different. Now, we can argue about whether that even happened now, but I can tell you that that's the difference in what we're talking about. So unfortunately, I told you there are a lot of dumb Christians, and there are. So that a lot of times we get in America especially, there's a weird thing. Like the whole point of your life is to be good and then you go to heaven, right? That just isn't the idea here, right? This makes me crazy. The idea of your idea of Christianity is God, you know, heaven is this temporary space where we wait for the new heaven and new earth. A new earth in which there will be go-karts. Why not? Like what? I mean, the problem is when we think of what has kind of people's idea of heaven, it's kind of like people floating around playing harps and like listening to long sermons, which is just not the Bible's vision of the new heaven and new earth. It's a world free from evil, right? But a world where we always remember where we came from. And it makes that world different. It makes that world special and better than the world we are in now. The world we know is unjust and corrupt and evil. We know it because God has made us in his image and likeness. God is there. And so we know that we long for that world that isn't like that. That's a great, good thing. And the good news I have for you is that it has already started to come. And that's pretty solid. As opposed to, boy, I hope one day we figure out this human nature problem. How are we going to do that? I know. The people who think that's all going to happen just by us, like, you know, sort of figuring it all out. I mean, it just isn't. I'm sorry. That's tough. But as I say, the good news is it doesn't have to work out that way. The good news is that we can replace our faith in something that's actually happened before, as opposed to something that hasn't. That's really a key idea here. And what you're always going to run into is terrible people who say they're Christians and maybe aren't, a lot of times, but also are like having terrible people in churches is not a malfunction, it's a function of how the church works. I mean that's literally something that Jesus Christ says you'll have. He calls them sheep and goats, wheat and tares. They're there together. It's just a function of it, right? So yeah, they're love. I hope that helps somewhat in that regard. And that's we can talk more about that, and I don't mind it. But at the end of the day, there has to be some definition for who good people are, not that we just make up on the spot. What do you think? Other questions? Fears, concerns? Really? No other questions? Okay, please.
Okay, this is about something you said earlier. You said that, I think that...
Oh boy, I say a lot of dumb things. Go ahead. I'm sorry, what was it? I'm sorry.
Media can make you docile,
Docile, yes.
Which, yes it can, but isn't there some media that can make you more aware of the shit you weren't aware of, or make you think? I know some...
Right, sure. Of course there is, right? But you have to also remember that something that makes you angry is also trying to control you too, right? I mean, every documentary you've ever seen is basically just trying to do that. I mean, documentaries are classic for this. Like there was this documentary they made a few years ago called The Making of a Murderer. It was on Netflix. It was a big thing. And you could, the way they used music, the way they used pictures, the way they used everything was to manipulate you to feel a certain way about this guy who was almost certainly a murderer. They were trying to make you feel that he wasn't, but he totally was. But the way the series was set up, the way they played the plaintive music, the way they showed him in jail, the way they showed him with his dog, right? It all made you feel that some injustice had happened. When spoiler alert, it hadn't happened, right? That's something we have to be really cognizant of. That there's all sorts of media that is always trying to control you, right? That's what I said at the beginning of this, right? Is that everyone who's talking to you is trying to control you in some way. And I do not take myself out of that because I'm a fallen human and a sinful man. I do not take myself out of that. I hope, though, that by drawing your attention to Christ and the reality of who we are and the reality of who is, that I've taken myself enough out of the equation that my stupidity and evil hasn't tried to force you to think a certain way. That is the goal, theoretically. It's hard, though. That's actually quite hard. But unfortunately, most people are just trying to make you just do what they want. For all it's worth. And they think, but the problem is they think they're doing a good thing, right? If the way we create the perfect world is to make everybody think a certain way, then it's my duty to make you think. Even a lie to you. It's called a noble lie, right? I'll even lie to you just to make you think of the right way. And it's a lie, but it's a lie because, you need it. Like, that's a thing. That's all over the place. Smart people say that's the way you get rubes to fall in line. Or, you probably don't say rubes out loud, but, uneducated people or less educated people, right? But it's all a question of what we actually believe and making you think a certain way. And it's everywhere. Sorry, that stinks. Wish it wasn't that way. It's bad. Other thoughts, questions, concerns? Please. Do you have a question? Uh-oh. Just no more, please. Stop. Or is it just praise Jesus? Because we're not really that kind of church, but I'll take it. I'll take it. I gotta tell you that right now. But anyway, sorry. All right. I'm 15 minutes over. I will stay here and answer questions for people who want them answered as long as you would like. But I also don't want to just hold people hostage because they feel like they've got to stay. So feel free to roll out. That's perfectly fine. But if you have more questions, this is pretty much my job. I just answer questions all day long. I'm here. Also, feel free if you have questions during the week to email me. I'm on Facebook too. But if you go to the parish website, you can go on. You find there's an email that all day long, and I'll answer any questions you have. You can even call me, I guess. Call the parish number and talk to me. I'm a dirty millennial, so talking to the phone is not my best forte. I don't know what to do with my hands, like anyway. But feel free to contact me if you have any more questions. And also feel free to come back next month where we'll talk about a different issue. And then by then, if you have other questions and you're like, I got to ask these questions now, this doesn't make sense to me, bring it, because I love it. I love questions. As Eugene Peterson said about pastors, they're it's a custodial work. It's like being a garbage collector, and I love garbage. Bring it all. Bring it on. I'll just jump right in there with you. We'll go through it. Okay. All right. I guess I say feel free to head out. If any other questions, please go ahead and ask them. I usually get some Columbo questions. I call them, where someone's like, "I've got one more thing" at the end of the class. It tends to be like the most important thing in their whole life that they ask me. But feel free to ask questions. I'm here as long as you need me.